The Republicans promised an uplifting, inspiring convention in contrast to what they called the Democrats' dark vision of America.
Over 4 days at the convention this week, speakers warned of chaos if President Trump is not reelected, and Florida figured so prominently. For the highlights and lowlights and Florida impact, two of the best political minds are with us today.
Ed Pozzuoli is an attorney in Fort Lauderdale, former chairman of the Broward Republican Party and influential voice in the Florida GOP. And Fernand Amandi is a pollster and political analyst. He runs Dixon and Amandi, which does polling research mostly for Democratic candidates and causes.
Good morning.
Great to see you guys. How are you?
Pleasure to be here.
Great. Ed, let me begin with you. Like you and like millions of other Americans, I watched all 4 nights of the convention, and when it was over, frankly, I felt pummeled, beaten up, exhausted, and not particularly uplifted by what I heard and saw. There were a few exceptions. Senator Tim Scott was fantastic in his speech, but what was your reaction?
Well, I think it did set up a clear choice between what you saw the week before, sort of an American first versus tearing down of America, law and order versus the destruction of American communities, sound immigration versus open borders, and frankly, freedom versus socialism. I think the convention, Republican convention, was about the promise of America, and the stories that were shared by Jeanette Nunez and Tim Scott and others really spoke to the promise of America. That's something we didn't hear the week before.
While you're talking about Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez, let's go ahead and just kind of start there, Fernand. The Lieutenant Governor just 4 years ago was calling then candidate Trump a con man. 4 years later, she is co-chairing Latinos for Trump going into this campaign, and she stood at that auditorium and really delivered a very powerful speech against socialism. Before you answer, let's take a little listen to what that sounded like.
Fellow Americans, the fabric of our nation is in peril. Daily, the radical left systematically chisels away at the freedoms we cherish. They peddle dangerous ideologies, cower to global progressives, and normalize socialism to dismantle our Constitution.
Fernand, I'm not sure if you were able to hear the Kamala Harris earlier on this program calling this kind of campaigning just totally off base and mischaracterizing what socialism is and what the Democratic campaign is. What do you think?
Well, needless to say, it's gaslighting and propaganda in its most disgusting and disturbing form. If you were watching from Mars, Glenna, you would have thought, watching that Republican convention, that there was a Democratic president in office responsible for the state of the country, not Donald Trump as the Republican president. You would have also thought that there was no coronavirus pandemic that has now nearly 6 million cases in the United States, nearly 200,000 that have lost their lives. On the question of socialism, it wasn't just Lieutenant Governor Nunez. South Florida's own Maximo Alvarez literally compared Joe Biden to Fidel Castro, when if there is anyone that draws apt comparisons to the detestable Fidel Castro, it's Donald Trump, who has called Trump, mind you, for the delaying of the American election. He has disenfranchised voters and made democracy more difficult by dismantling and admitting to doing so the post office before our very eyes. He has favored and sided with America's enemies and dictators, whether they be Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un. He has also demonized the American press and called them the enemy of the people and the state.
All right,
the
Fernand, hold on just a minute. I think you've enumerated so many of the faults you see with Donald Trump. I want to give Ed Pozzuoli a chance to respond. Ed, what do you say to that?
I was almost falling asleep on that. Sorry. Talk about gaslighting. My gosh. Look, let's stay positive. Jeanette Nunez came in and talked about the horrors of Castro's Cuba and how America opened up its both doors and heart to Jeanette's family. And think about where she came from and where she is today as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Florida. It's the same story that we heard from Tim Scott, the promise of America, the American dream, when Scott's family his grandfather went from picking cotton in one generation, now he's in Congress. This is the promise of America, and this is what we've seen all last week at the Republican convention. If you want to say that's gaslighting, then I'm in favor of that.
Ed, can I go, Fernand, please, go ahead.
Ed talks about the law and order party. Really, Ed? What about when the Hatch Act violations were taking place? Not a norm that was broken, Ed, but a law that was violated. Having the Secretary of State, who is an official in the federal government, offer his personal political support for the president, weaponizing and using American federal properties like the White House, the Washington Monument, something that had never been done before. There should have been yellow crime scene tape put around that convention when it was over. So let's not go back and forth. Let's talk about this in good faith, Ed, and yes, end the gaslighting that the Republicans and you are doing right now.
Can I just go back, can I bring it back to a little Florida-centric for a moment? Because I think a lot of people are looking at this convention and wondering, where's Governor Ron DeSantis? I mean, the president made him a household name back when he was running for governor. Everyone talks about, there's a narrative of how close they are, although we've seen the governor depart from a lot of things the president has done in the past 4 years. They don't walk in lockstep all the time, but everyone was really expecting Governor DeSantis to have a presence at the convention. He even taped something on video that was never played. Ed, what happened?
No, I think Florida was well represented. The Lieutenant Governor was there. Maximo Alvarez was there talking about his promise of America, what he experienced. I think Pam Bondi was there. She spoke about America being the land of opportunity and actually did what I thought was an excellent prosecutorial role on what the truth is around the Biden family. So if you look at those things, Florida was well represented there. And one other point I want to make, if you think about what like Maximo Alvarez, this idea that somebody comes and starts a business and this is the last best hope. America is the last best hope. Why do people feel that way? And the reason is because this is a place where opportunity abounds. And I'm going to share a personal story. You know, you all know that my in-laws are from Cuba, my wife's family, and we visited there a couple of years back. And frankly, my mother-in-law for the first time went ahead and talked in front of my kids about what it was like to be tossed out of Cuba and be shown gunpoint out of their family business, and how she went and talked about America being the land of opportunity when they had nothing in their pocket to make something of themselves. And I'm going to tell you something, that is real, and that is not gaslighting.
So can I just throw out that Maximo Alvarez, who is in the gasoline business and very successful, has been successful in South Florida through several presidencies and through several parties' presidencies.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, I mean, let's talk about Maximo Alvarez for a second, because I am the son, like Maximo Alvarez, of someone who was forced to come to the United States fleeing that disgusting regime in Cuba in the 1960s. The great irony of all this, and the one that Ed Pozzuoli will not talk about or mention, is that if Maximo Alvarez had to come to the United States in 1961 like he did, like my father did, he would not have been allowed in the United States if the president was Donald Trump, because of the policies preventing people seeking asylum from coming to this wonderful country. In fact, it was John F. Kennedy, a Democratic president, who allowed Maximo Gomez and my father and my mother and my Cuban grandparents to make this wonderful life of the American dream here in this country. And again, speaking about the utter hypocrisy of Mr. Alvarez comparing Joe Biden to Fidel Castro, Mr. Alvarez has made a very successful business in the gasoline industry. I guess he doesn't have any qualms having made some of those millions using and buying Maduro's and Chavez's gasoline.
Yeah, I'm going to, Fernand, I am going to interrupt you because although factually, as far as I know, you're right, don't want to have this conversation without some response from Mr. Alvarez, and we know his history. We saw him at the convention. Ed, I think a very basic question. Do we need a break? Yeah, we're going to take a break here for a second. We'll be back with Ed Pozzuoli, Fernand Amandi in just a minute. On This Week in South Florida, we are looking at the Republican and Democratic conventions with Ed Pozzuoli of Fort Lauderdale, president of the Tripp Scott Law Firm, and pollster and political analyst Fernand Amandi. Gentlemen, I think it's pretty clear that in his acceptance speech throughout this convention, President Trump made it clear he is the law and order candidate, and he spoke out vehemently against people who have been protesting, including Black Lives Matter people. Here is the sort of the operative soundbite from the convention.
If the Democrat Party wants to stand with anarchists, agitators, rioters, looters, and flag burners, that is up to them. But I, as your president, will not be a part of it. The Republican Party will remain the voice of the patriotic heroes who keep America safe and salute the American flag.
Ed Pozzuoli, it's a strong message. In fact, takes me back to Richard Nixon, who ran as the law and order candidate as well back in '72. Is this going to be the main pitch of Donald Trump?
Well, let me recharacterize a little bit of what you led in with. It wasn't that the president is against lawful protesters. It's the president is against those who will destroy property and cause lives to be in jeopardy. The violence in the street is what is essentially anarchy in some of our major cities. I think it's an important distinction to make. I will stand up for someone's right to lawfully protest, regardless of what I think of their sign or their cause. However, when it turns to violence, then you simply have anarchy. One other point I want to make, Michael, with respect to Armand's diatribe before the break, I'm reminded of the words from the McCarthy hearings. Have you no sense of decency, sir? To attack a fine American like Max Alvarez is just unbelievable. And I say, have you no sense of decency?
I think we might invite Max Alvarez for another program at another time. You know what? Both conventions over the past couple of weeks really presented voters with very different views on how to deal with current crises, whether it is the COVID pandemic, whether it is a racial reckoning in this country. Fernand, is there any voter who has not yet decided who to vote for?
Well, I think the polls suggest, Glenna, that the undecideds are low. But I think the question is, if some voters are so disgusted by this horrific rhetoric coming out of the White House, coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump, that they may question whether they want to participate in this most critical election in American history. But I think we have to go back to the question again that was framed at the outset now of this segment. Trump's law and order that you used in the clip earlier, it's law and order, sure, if you believe in Fidel Castro's type of law and order, where, again, innocent, peaceful protesters had to be violently restrained by Donald Trump, a restraint that actually responded with a rebuke from President Trump's own defense secretary, Esper, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Miley, who said that was inappropriate, unacceptable conduct, and even the former defense secretary that said it was un-American and anti-constitutional. Yeah. Trump's law and order is very much like Castro's law and order, where you can enrich yourself. The president has enriched his own self and his family at the expense of the taxpayers, while others cannot engage in that same type of behavior. So I think it's a very hypocritical element that we see on display, offered by the president himself and rebuked by members of his own government and cabinet.
Ed, would you like to respond? I'm sure you would.
Yeah, look, in the end, Americans can protest. They have the right to protest. And regardless of what their protest may be, I think they have a right to redress their government. I think it's important. I think it's something that we should encourage and allow. And it's not a question of us allowing it. It is every American's right to do so. However, when you see cities that are basically engulfed in lawlessness, frankly, in New York, when Fifth Avenue stores are boarded up and people are afraid, where you have a number of police officers there, almost 25% of the police force in New York City, police officers taking early retirement because they feel unsupported by the administration there. Yeah. When you see lawlessness in Portland and when you see lawlessness in Minneapolis, It is time for us to segment out the difference between having a lawful protest by fine Americans, regardless of their political beliefs, on one hand, versus unlawful destruction of property and violence for violence sake and anarchy on the other. And those are two big distinctions that my friend on the other side simply fails to recognize.
We are going to have to leave it there for time. Smart, passionate men. We love having you, and thank you for your time.
Fernand,
Ed Pozzuoli,
thank you.
Fernand
Thank you.
Amandi. Thanks so much.